Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. How are you doing today? I hope that all things are going really well for you. For today's tutorial, we're going to look at creating this chandelier pendant. Now this works with some faceted graduated rondelles, which is a challenge I was set recently with my friends over on the social group. It also works with some hammered washers. So let's head down to the board, take a closer look at the project, and then we'll make one together today. So here is the pendant in question. Now one of the reasons I really like a design like this is because you have a lot of movement and you have an articulated veil up at the top. So I won't go through the hammering process again, as I've done that quite a few times, and recently I've discussed with you the differences between hammering different metals. So let's just pop this baby up in the corner and then we can move on with today's tutorial. I've chosen 3 different sizes of rondelles from the faceted rondelle strand, and I've also got 3 different sizes of washer, and these have already been textured. Now the smallest inner aperture is on the brass, so that's where I will be using the smallest rondelle. And then like so. Now on my original design I've put the largest of rondelles in the centre in the copper one, but you can obviously play around with the design completely. The first thing we're going to do is to suspend the faceted rondelle inside the centre of that washer that's been textured, and then we're going to ensure that we can actually use, instead of the washer to hang everything from, we're going to use the loop that we create to connect everything together as the hanging point as well. So I'm just going to show you this one time, but what you will need to do is make sure that your bead sits centrally inside your chosen washer when you make that first bend. So I'm going to just make sure that that bead sits where I want it to before I bend the wire of the standard head pin. So if you're going to be using rondelles with very fine drill apertures, it might be a little bit tricky because we need a little bit of residual strength. This is a standard head pin, it's not an ultra fine one. So I'm going to make sure that that sits where I want it to before I make that forwards bend. Now a lot of head pins tend to be made from fairly low grade material. I think this is iron with a silver plating on top. So you can play around with which metal you use for the head pin as to how thin you can get that before it ceases to be effective in its job. So if we just hold this in position, you can see that the bend is going to sit inside the inner aperture of that washer, and I just want that bead to be centralized. We're now going to use any round form. You could use round pliers. I'm going to use my favorite little tool of the day, which is these memory wire finishing pliers, to create a rounded aperture. So I'm just going to do that in 2 bites, bring that all the way around. Now if you notice, I've made that into a spiral rather than a squidged up loop, and that's because it will be easier then to add on that washer into the gap in the middle. And if you just check that that sits where you want it to, that is how it's going to look when it's completed. So what we now need to do is just flip this outwards, close up that little loop, give it a squish, and then you can hold across that round form that you've created. And if it's very tight, such as with those thicker pieces of metal on the other style of washer, you may need to just arrange the washer to sit slightly sideways and out of the way, and in that way you'll be able to get a better grip on it whilst you move that wire around to close up a really nice, neat and tidy little bit of wrapping up that neckline. Now as I mentioned, I think this is an iron head pin, so they tend to be a little bit trickier to do the things you want them to do, but you really do want to take that time to get a nice neat wrap going. So if it doesn't work out, grab yourself another head pin or just go slightly slower than I am. So I'm going to trim away that end section, and I'll just try to tidy this up slightly before I move on to creating the same design on those other 2 beads and washer assemblies. So you can just grip that however makes most sense to you and your body, your abilities, and just tidy up the end of that wire. So what you will need to do is repeat that with the other two pieces so that we can move on to the next stage of today's tutorial. What you may notice is I've done this fire burst, almost like a firework scoring on the back of my washer. That's just because I wanted to play around with different textures. So I've got that classic dimpled with the ball side of my hammer. And then I've struck down at a 45-degree angle with the sharp edge of my chasing hammer, just to give that slightly different effect. We'll be doing some different hammering techniques as the year moves on. So I've carefully set each one of those differently sized faceted rondelles in the centre of my hammered washers, and you can see that I'm planning to use the loop that we created to connect that bead to the washer as the place that we also hang it from the chandelier part of today's design. So we're going to use slightly heavier gauge wire today to create that design so that it lasts a lovely long time in wear. Let's head down to the board and we'll create the next stage of today's tutorial. I've cut a 12-inch length of 1.25mm, approximately equivalent to 16 gauge wire, and I'm using a lovely raw copper today. So let's give that a bit of a warm through. Then we're going to start about 3 inches from one end. Now I'm going to be using my multi-step bail making pliers today, and I think I'll probably use step number 4 for those. So around about 3 inches from one end, I'm just going to start by turning that loop all the way around and just assessing whether that's a nice shape or not. I think I've slightly mangled it, so I'm just going to pop those pliers back in, give that a bit of a wiggle and get that to sit exactly how I want it to. That's a little bit better. So we will be opening that out just a little bit. So instead of being a circular form, it looks a little bit like a fish now. It's more of a classic pear drop shape. So we're going to warm through that next step of that wire, just a couple of inches or so, to get a little bit more fluidity into this. You can even use a heavier wire. I've demonstrated here with 1.6mm or 14 gauge wire. It's a little bit of a stretch, to be honest. It doesn't need to be quite that heavy. So 1.25 or approximately 16 gauge will be absolutely fine. So step number 4, and we're going to create another loop. Draw that wire all the way around again. Now this one does need to be more of a circular form, so just give that a wiggle if it comes away from you and just get that to sit down in the middle. So what we're looking for here, if I put this down on the board, is to have a nice line of wire coming up centrally over that middle loop, and then we're going to try and repeat that form, so looking at creating the same distance between the next pear-shaped loop. So step number 4 again. Just pop that into position and bring the wire around. Now, if you make that far too far away, that's a little bit too far away, you can pop those pliers in, draw the wire back a little bit, and then roll the wire around, give it a bit of a wiggle, and you should be able to get that to sit more where you'd like it to. So if I just pop those pliers down out of the way now, what we're looking for is a nice imaginary line going up the middle of that central loop. And we want these 2 wires up at the top to just sit on that imaginary line. So we're looking for similar shapes. You can take a little bit longer than I have just to get that looking correct. Give that a bit of a wiggle and it should kind of sit where you want it to. Now what we're going to do is to start feeding on our designs that we've already created. So you can do whatever order you like, to be perfectly honest. What I'm going to do is just show this to you sideways. Those loops are all created where the wire crosses over the top. So I'm just going to open out very softly each of those loops. Let me just show you that middle one. I just hold it like so. Open that loop out and then open that last one out. It's just making enough space for us to start feeding on our little washer designs. So what we need to be mindful of is that we get all of those dimples facing the same way. So I'm going to start on holding the piece in my hand like so, and I'm going to start with the dimples facing me. I'm going to load that onto the end piece of wire, bring that all the way around, and now it sits down in that central loop. Now what you'll see is that we've now got the starburst or firework side. So when you load on your next one, and I think I'm going to go for the brass on this side, you will need to make sure that you start with the same orientation. so that you finish with the same orientation. So let us add on that last one, which is the stainless steel version, and that sits automatically down into position. So I prefer the dimpled look, but I just wanted to show you that there are definitely ways that you can play around with texturing. Once you've got each of those little forms into position, you could measure that gap. To my eye, it just looks like it might be a tiny bit too large there. So I'm just going to very quickly roll it around a little bit, draw the wire back and get that down into position. By eye, that looks just a little bit better. So if I flip that over and then very gently close up each of those small loop apertures that we created a moment ago, pop that down on the board, you can see that we're almost there already. So in my original design, I've got very, very short bits of wire up at the top creating loops, into which I've added this sealed double wrapped loop, which acts then as a beautiful aid to mobility in this design. It's an articulated bail. It gives the design a lot of movement. There's also ways that you can use this in design for art around the house. If you want to make sun catchers or something to hang up in the garden, then it's another way that you can use an articulated bail. So I'll head back down to the board and I'll show you how you can add that on as an articulating bail, and we'll take it from there. Now, if you wanted to create a standard bail, all you would need to do is to turn the longer piece of wire upright at that crossover point, and the piece of wire on the side here over to the 3 o'clock position, and then wrap one around the other to create a standard bail. Now, the reason that I wanted to show you an articulating bail is because sometimes, with the best will in the world, you occasionally end up with less wire than you think you should have had. So sometimes you'll kink the end of the wire, or you just didn't cut quite enough and you need to make these small loops. That works if you're working in a nice heavy wire like I have here. So let's pop that down back onto the board and I'll show you how you can recreate that design, and in an emergency you can save a design by adding that articulated bail. So what we're going to do here is bring both of these wires upright just past the point where they cross over. So let's push one up first, and then just on the other side, just past the point where that crosses over, upright again. So you can have them either side if you want, and not have them cross over. I quite like the idea of them crossing over, but that's a design aesthetic that you're completely in control of. If you don't like the crossover look, you can just prise them apart and have them side by side instead. I'm going to go for that crossover look, and we're just going to trim that wire to around about 1/2 inch, like so. Make sure you grab hold of those end bits. We're going to use this to create that articulated bail in a moment, and that's going in the melt pot. It'll be fine for creating a spiral charm of some description. So we've got some 1/2 inch lengths of wire just here. Once you've had a chance to just make sure everything is exactly where you want it to be at pains to just make sure they're exactly the same length. You may need to shave the tiniest amount off. As it happens, that looks fine. I am just going to make sure that those two wires sit parallel though. And then I'm going to grab again my 6-step bail making pliers to create some loops. Now, because there is depth to this design, not just because of the crossing over of wires, but because we've got rondelles sitting opposite to the body, what we're going to do is to create these loops coming completely backwards rather than coming forwards and making them round as one would normally do on a bail. So I'm just going to push those a little bit further apart to make it easier for me to get in, and I think I'm going to use number 3 on my bail making pliers. Just wrap that all the way around. If number 3 doesn't quite cut it, you can certainly make that a little bit smaller. So again, just make sure that that's prised apart. Make sure you're using the same sized round form, whether that's your bail making pliers or another piece that you may be working with. Let's pop that back in. Take that a little bit further. So I feel like I need to close that up by hand because the size I want isn't exactly the same as is on my bail makers. Step 2 is too small and step 3 is too large. So what you can do is make sure that they are straight and side by side. Take a second to just ensure that that's good and true. And then what we're going to do, if I hold this sideways, is just draw those end bits down so that they meet the piece of wire that they come from. So just push that all the way round. Now I wouldn't do this with a 1mm 18 gauge wire. I can just about do this with this 1.25mm 16 gauge wire. Definitely safer with the 1.6mm or 14 gauge wire. So let's just have a look at the first piece together and make sure that we're happy with how that sits. Do take time to just bring those cut ends to the piece of wire that it comes from. So you can see there's a teeny tiny gap just here. So I will go off screen for a moment and just take a second to make sure that this is exactly perfect and that I retain the roundness and that I'm happy with that shape and form before we move on to adding that articulated bail. So don't be afraid to invest time into making those loops sit exactly where you want them to. If for some reason it all goes a bit squishy and you just don't like it, it's not a vast amount of wire. If you are going to make jewellery that you're really proud of, then do either take the time or just give it another go. If it doesn't go quite right, don't be worried about investing a little bit of extra wire and making that absolutely perfect so you can be super proud of your jewellery. So I've been left with a 5-inch length of that 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. If your length of wire remaining is much shorter than that, I would suggest cutting yourself an extra piece. For me, it's just working out. So do just bear that in mind. If it's much shorter than 5 inches, then do consider adding a new piece of wire. Something like this is always going to find a use, so don't worry, you won't be overly wasteful. What we're going to do is give that a quick warm through. And then I'm going to pinch in the very middle, and I'm probably going to use number 4 for the hanging loop and maybe number 5 for the bit that goes through the top of our pendant design. So let's just see what that looks like. We can always make that smaller if we need to. So let's just bring that around. That looks like a really good size. So I've made the loop that I want to add into that pendant or anything that you're going to rescue because you only had enough wire left to make small loops. We can now make that into a nice secure hanging loop. So I'm just going to grab hold of the wire inside the loop shape that we've created and just bring the short end over so that it sits over to the 9 o'clock position. And then I'm going to take the long piece of wire and take that up to what would be the 12 o'clock position. Just need to refine that shape slightly. And if you're unhappy with the roundness of that piece, just give it a little bit of a reform with your pliers. I'm going to make that slightly smaller, I think. Give it a little bit of a squish to make it nice and secure, and then we're going to feed that onto the loops we've created up at the top of our design. So just bring that all together. And then what we're going to do is tie off with 2 wrapped loops. So on the lower side, I've encompassed the use of those 2 loops up at the top of our chandelier design. I'm going to bring that tail of wire around. Now, if you don't have the grip strength to do that, do feel free to grab in a second pair of pliers. I'm just going to grip across that round form. You could use nylon tips if you're concerned about marking your wire. And I'm just going to make very small movements and draw that so that the cut end sits around the back of the design. So all that remains now is to create a right angle just up at the top of that wrap, leaving a very tiny gap just here, into which we can wrap some excess wire in a moment. So bring that forwards, and then we're going to create that hanging loop. So it's exactly the same thing again. I won't show you, it's just a wrapped loop. And it just means that you can hang the design around the neckline utilising whatever threading material you like. So it's just another wrapped loop to bring that all together, and then you've created yourself that chandelier design using hammered washers and those different sizes graduated faceted rondelles. So here we have the completed chandelier design. You could make them as earrings. I mean, I like big earrings and long earrings and fancy earrings. So you've got lots of opportunities to use that around your designs. whether you're making for home decor or whether you're making for jewellery. I just want to say thank you to all of my subscribers and also to my fantastic members. I've got Stephanie, Barbara, Zandra and Erlene to say a huge thank you to for being a member here at the Gemhawks YouTube channel. If you want to find out more, head over to the members page and you can see what perks you get. Thanks so much for watching. Have yourself the most beautiful day, and I look forward to welcoming you here again to the Gemhawks YouTube channel very, very soon. Bye for now.